Hello folks, welcome to another Darktable Landscapes video. In this one we're going to be looking at how to focus stack using Darktable with a little bit of help from GIMP. Let's get into it. So before we dive into the actual nitty-gritty of doing the focus stack itself, I thought it'd be a good idea just to touch on depth of field and focusing and why we need to focus stack in the first place. So I'm going to duck into a little bit of theory. If you feel you're already kind of confident with why it works and how it works, then by all means skip to the next stage. I'll put a chapter marker so that you can just skip the theory part. But if you want to know why depth of field is a thing and why aperture affects depth of field, then we'll look at that now. One of the first things that many of us learn when we first get ourselves a proper camera, a camera with manual controls, is the exposure triangle, which is a way of expressing the relationship between the three main variables we have control of with a camera, of course, which are aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. And shutter speed, generally pretty intuitive, faster shutter speeds, freeze motion, slower shutter speeds, smear motion. ISO is often kind of incorrectly analogized as the sensitivity of the sensor. That's not what it is, but that's not what this video is about. And then aperture is kind of slightly less intuitive, really. We're told that it affects the depth of field, and the depth of field is what's sharp front to back. But generally, it's kind of skipped over as to why that actually happens. It's because it's kind of slightly complicated, more complicated than the beginner needs to know. But it does tie into what we're doing in this video, which is looking at focus stacking. So I'm just going to do a very, very brief and amateur overview of why aperture affects depth of field, and hopefully that will make things a little bit clearer as to why we can do focus stacking to improve our sharpness. When we focus a lens, we are making light from a given distance converge on our sensor in such a way that we get a perfectly sharp image for that distance. Let's have a look at a very simple diagram. Here's our point of focus. So this is the distance that we've focused our lens at, and light from this point is falling on our sensor perfectly. Now light is diverging from this point at all angles, and with a large aperture we're capturing a lot of that light that's diverging from all those different angles. And because of that, there's a point where the light has diverged from the point of focus at an angle such that it's no longer sharp. Okay, so inside the depth of field, the light rays are still kind of parallel enough. It's still at the kind of the right angle, or the similar angle to the point of focus, that they're not truly sharp, but we can't tell the difference. Okay, so they're kind of visually sharp, even if they're not technically sharp. And with a large aperture, we're capturing so many of those rays that they kind of overwhelm the rays that are coming in at the same angle as the point of focus, or near enough. And so we have this depth of field. Okay. So if we look at the same kind of diagram for a smaller aperture, we can see that we have a much deeper depth of field, of course. And the reason for that is when we close our aperture down, we're limiting the angle at which those rays from our point of focus and all the other angles can come into the sensor. So we're limiting those angles to light rays that are parallel enough to being truly focused, that they appear focused for longer, if you like. So now we get a much deeper depth of field because we're limiting those rays coming in from sharper, steeper angles that quickly become unsharp or out of focus. Okay, so that being said, why don't we simply stop our aperture down all the way to f32, and then we've got as much depth of field as we can, and we can carry on with as much focus as we like? Well, the problem we have with that is a law of physics called diffraction. To explain diffraction, I've developed this highly detailed diagram of an aperture. So these are the blades of the aperture. Here's the aperture itself, and the sensor which captures the light. And what happens when we take a photo? The light comes in, and then it passes through the aperture, and then when light passes through any gap, it bends slightly. Okay, and with a large aperture that doesn't bend much at all. You can see the light rays remain more or less parallel. Okay, but what happens when we close that aperture down, or we make a smaller gap for the light to pass through, is essentially this. So the light comes in and it diverges much more radically from that parallel, and the result of that can be seen more easily if we kind of flip this image around and look at the sensor head on. So if we're looking at our sensor head on, as if we're looking through the lens, or down the lens rather, we can see that at f5.6, our light ray kind of falls nicely on a pixel. So each of these squares is obviously a very, very simplified diagram of a digital sensor, is a pixel in the final image. At a reasonably wide open aperture, f5.6, our light is falling on one pixel, and so that's nice and sharp. And then we start to stop the aperture down. So let's say f11, which is kind of a very common landscape aperture to go for. We're starting to get a little bit of blur. So the light that was normally falling on one pixel of the sensor at f5.6 is now kind of smeared a little bit. The diffraction, the interference caused by the diffraction, has caused this light to kind of blur and fall on a couple, just the edges around here of the neighboring sensor pixels. And so it's probably not noticeable at normal viewing, but we're starting to lose a little bit of sharpness from that diffraction. And if we stop that down even more, let's say we go to say f16, which is normally too much on, certainly on a crop sensor camera and probably the borders of a full frame sensor, you can see that we're really getting a lot of overlap from what should fall on one pixel starts to really fall onto the surrounding pixels. And so that's the effect of diffraction. That's why there's a diminishing return when it comes to closing your aperture down. Okay, so we've established that we can't just use a very small aperture to get a super deep depth of field, especially when we've got things close to the camera and far away that we want to get into focus because of diffraction. We have this kind of diffraction limits, if you like. So what are our options? We can use a thing called hyperfocal distance, where you kind of calculate a specific focus point, a specific distance from the camera, focus on that, and you get a certain amount of very deep depth of field from that. I find that's not that reliable, especially nowadays. Modern lenses don't really have very accurate distance scales. You can kind of fudge it with phone apps like PhotoPills, but in general it's more fiddle than it's worth, in my opinion. If you want to use it, that's obviously entirely up to you. So another alternative is focus stacking. So what is focus stacking? Essentially, instead of using one image with a small aperture to get a deep depth of field, we instead use a larger aperture, say a kind of a more optimal aperture, if you like, say f5.6, and we take multiple shots focusing differently in each. So in these three shots I took up in Glencoe last month, for this first shot I focused here in the foreground that was very close to the camera. For the second shot I focused here in the midground, and for the final shot I focused on the mountain, on the buckle itself. You can see my settings are all virtually the same. The shutter speed adjusted itself with aperture priority just a little bit for the changing light, the clouds moving over, but the aperture is f5.6. The focal length is 12mm all the way along. Okay, so essentially three identical shots taken with a tripod, so there's as little movement as possible between them, and focusing on three different points for each one. So the first step in doing a focus stack is just your basic kind of processing on the images itself that you do with any image, regardless of focus stack. So I'm going to just do the first one, and then we can copy and paste those settings to the other two, and then we'll do our actual stack. So I'm going to go into this one, and we'll go through my usual kind of workflow, which regular viewers will be pretty familiar with. Get our white balance about right. It's maybe a bit yellow. Not too bad. And then we'll do some exposure. I think the exposure is actually pretty good. Maybe push it a little bit. And let's go for color balance RGB. And we'll push the vibrance a little bit. Contrast. Drop our shadows, drop our highlights a touch. I think I'll probably do a different treatment on the sky. But the way the focused stacking works is, in fact, we won't see the sky in this image. We'll see it from our final image where we focused on the mountain instead. But we may as well do it in this one, and we'll see how we go. We can always adjust it in the other image afterwards. Okay, we've added some contrast. Let's do contrast equalizer, and we'll use my preset, which is clarity. So that's just essentially raising this whole bar by rolling the mouse wheel to make it bigger I think that's probably a bit too much, so I'm just going to bring it down. Okay, we'll call that clarity. I'm going to make a new instance of that, and I'm going to call this one texture. This one I'm just going to drag up our endpoints. Pick out the texture of that moorland. Okay, let's do a little bit of color grading. So we'll do RGB primaries. And let's see what we can do. Not really following a deeper meaningful process here. I'm just kind of playing around till I get a result I like. It looks pretty good to me. So there's the before, which is a little bit kind of yellowy and green from the new moss and things that are growing up on the moor up there. I'm just taking that down to a bit more of a slightly brown tone. And now let's do something about the sky. So the first thing I'll do for the sky is maybe just drop the exposure a little bit. So I'll duplicate my exposure module, just drop the exposure touch, and then obviously we want to mask this to the sky. So we'll use a drawn and parametric mask. And we'll pop a gradient about there. But we're still making the mountain dark, so we'll just pull up the dark values to exclude them. It's a bit too much. Drag that all the way back. Yeah, okay, and maybe just pull exposure up a touch. Because we're okay, and the next thing we'll do is go to color calibration and duplicate, hit the grade tab, and then for your particular image, you just want to kind of experiment and see which of these channels gives you the most sky contrast. I think in this case, red is probably what we want to do. And now we want to use a parametric mask again, or drawn parametric, why not? And we'll pop on gradient, and we'll also remove the mountain from the effect. So we're just going to adjust that slightly, just select our sky. A little bit of feathering, a little bit of blurring. There we go. And I'm just going to change the blend mode from normal to multiply. And there we go, instant drama. And I'm just going to drop the opacity a little bit just so it's a little bit more subtle. 75% should do it. Okay, now I'd like to add some emphasis to the mountain itself. Maybe some local contrast. If I add that to the whole image, it's going to look very weird and messy. There's already a lot of kind of fine detail in all the foliage and moss and heather and all that kind of thing in the foreground here. So we don't want to enhance everything. We just want to focus attention here on the mountain a little bit. So let's go for a diffuse and sharpen module. And we don't want any of those ones. We'll have a completely fresh one. So I'll just duplicate that. And let's set the preset to local contrast fine. And there we go. You can see that that's kind of too much, really. It's almost looking like a really poor HDR effect. So let's get rid of it. We'll just focus it on the mountain itself. We'll use a drawn and parametric mask. So we'll grab the path tool, draw a rough path around the mountain. We don't have to worry too much because we'll be using the parametrics to refine things. Went a bit weird up there. Sort that out. There we go. And just check out our mask. So yeah, that's fairly rough. Let's remove the sky first of all. So we'll remove the lighter values and then pull them back. Okay, and we can maybe pull it out a little bit here, pull the feathering out, reduce it so it's overlapping the sky much less. I'll maybe just add another point there with a control click just to give me more control. And let's see how that looks off and on. Yeah, you can see we just pulled the detail out on the mountain without doing it everywhere. Just enhances it a little bit. Okay, let's add a vignette. We'll just emphasize this central portion. So we'll duplicate our exposure module. Anyone will do. Just drop the exposure as a test for now. And then we'll do a drawn mask. And yeah, I could probably just get away with a normal ellipse, I think, and tweak it. So at the moment, as always, when we first use this elliptical mask, it's the wrong way around. It's selecting everything inside it. We want to flip that with the polarity button here. And there we go. Let's pull that in a little bit and see how that looks. Maybe a touch darker. And just increase the feathering on that a little bit as well. The shift roll. And we'll call that vignette. Okay, final steps, we'll just sharpen this up. So we've already got a diffuse or sharpen module here, so I'll just duplicate it with a right click. We'll set this to sharpen demosaicing no AA filter. Duplicate it again, and we'll choose lens deblur soft. And by the same principle that we add an exposure vignette to kind of focus attention using light, we also want to do that with our sharpening as well. So I'm just going to go down to the drawn mask and choose the same shape as exposure vignette. It doesn't remember the polarity, so that's fine. That's where we want it. I will just shrink it a little bit though. There we go. So that's our one, and we'll just do it the same thing here as well. And this time we can use diffuse or sharpen 4, which is our previous one. It's given us the same mask. And now we just focused our sharpening really where we want it, as opposed to all over the image. Okay, so here's our processed image, our first one in the focus stack where we focused in the foreground. And now we just want to copy the adjustments from this one to the others. So this is super easy. We'll make sure we've clicked that one. We'll pop out this right-hand panel. And then in the history stack section, we'll hit copy. And then we'll control click these two once we've clicked off that one, and we will paste. And then we'll see these two updating. And just looking at the sky in this one, as I said, this one will be the one where we actually see the sky. That looks fine to me. So we're good to go, or we're almost good to go. There's one final thing. Presumably because you don't want to apply a lens profile to an image taken with a different lens. When you copy and paste the history stack from one image to the other, it doesn't copy the lens correction module. So what you'll find is that there'll be some difference in the geometry of the image when you try and stack them. So what we have to do is just pop in and manually add that lens correction module, which is just a matter of turning it on. It's that one. Into here. And lens correction again. There we go. And now they definitely match up. So now the final step is just to select them all and go down to our export block. And you can see I've changed the file format here. So rather than JPEG, which is a lossy format, I've changed the format to TIFF, 16-bit bit depth, and I'm not setting any size. I'm just using full resolution so that we've got maximum quality, because we're going to be putting this through GIMP and saving it out afterwards anyway. So we want to preserve as much detail and information as we can. JPEG will undo a lot of that. So we've got it set to 16-bit TIFF. I'm going to output that to a folder, and then we can work with it in GIMP. Okay, so here we are in GIMP. If you're unfamiliar with GIMP, it's essentially a free pixel image editor, sort of a free and open source version of Photoshop in terms of what it does. And we can do things with GIMP that we can't do with Darktable, purely because we'll be dealing with pixels rather than with raw data. And In addition to GIMP, I'm also going to be using a free plugin called GMic QT. You can see it here on my filters list. I'll put the link to download this in the description below, but it's very straightforward. Just download it and install like you do any other program, and then it's ready and available to go for in GIMP. Okay, so let's pull in our images. I'll go to File and Open as Layers, and this will open multiple images as layers in a single GIMP image. And here's our three images here. So 1909, 1910 and 1911, those are our three processed TIFFs. So I'm going to click all of them and click Open. Now you may get a message while this is loading in about converting RGB profiles. You can just click Keep for those. I've kind of ticked the Don't Ask Again box on that one. And there we go. So we've got three layers here in our layers palette on the right, and we can turn those off and on to see that we've got three different images. So you can see the clouds are moving in between each shot. Okay, what will normally happen, unless your tripod is a particularly fancy one and the conditions are particularly still, is you will get some slight tripod movement or camera movement between shots. In this case, I don't think mine's actually too bad, because considering I was submerged in a marsh, there wasn't too much wind. So I don't think there's too much in terms of movement, but there's a way to check it, and I'll show you how to do that now. So if you change your blending mode over here, so these are very similar to mask blending modes in Darktable. If you click that down and scroll down to where it says Difference, you can see it makes the image look quite weird. Now, as I said, we're kind of lucky with this one, is that I haven't got much movement. So what I'm going to do is kind of artificially move it, if you like, by using the Move tool. If I nudge the image up, you can see how the difference blending mode really shows up. So this is where you will normally see kind of movement. You'll see these bright lines along mountain horizons and that kind of thing. So that's a good check to see if you've really got a lot of camera movement. But either way, we're going to correct for it. So I'm just going to put that back where it was. If I click the right button, there we go. I could just undo it, but there we go. So you can see how it's just going back to no difference whatsoever. And of course we can check both layers. So that's our first layer, our farthest focused layer. Let's just pop that back on difference as well. See if there's any shift between these two layers. And again, nothing much. So this is kind of making the layer see-through. You're seeing the difference between this layer and this layer here. So the middle layer and the bottom layer. And that's fine. We'll click normal again, and we'll just turn this one back on, and we'll turn that one back to normal. Now, obviously, if you have got movement between frames, aligning them manually would be a nightmare, unless it's a very small shift, especially if you've got a shifting kind of more than one axis. So this is where the first use of GMic QT comes in. So I'm going to click Filters and GMic QT. I'm calling it GMic QT because that's how it reads. So I'm not sure if that's what it's actually called. The makers of GMic QT will have to forgive me. And you can see there's actually lots and lots of filters that this tool provides, and you can have a play. Some of them are very kind of stylized and not really anything I use, but some of them are very useful. And what I'm going to use first of all here is in the layers section, align layers. Okay, and what that will do is automatically align layers, make sure there's no difference between them in terms of kind of geometry, if you like. So all these default settings are fine. And input output, we're going to make sure that it says input layers all, so it's taking all the layers into account, and the output mode is in place. So we could have it outputting as new layers, as a new image, but we're just going to keep in place. So it's just going to edit the layers in place. So we're going to go OK. It will have a think, and then it will do it. Okay, now we probably won't notice much difference because, as I said, I was kind of lucky with the alignment of my shots. But there we go with the difference blend mode again. That looks fine. They're all nicely aligned. Okay, now we can finally get around to actually stacking the images. Now the first thing I want to do is, if I look at the layer panel here, 09 is the first image in the stack, which is the foreground focused image. 10 is obviously the middle ground, and then 11 is the the background. So these are kind of the wrong way around in my my brain. So I'm going to drag this layer to the bottom by clicking and dragging there, and I'm going to drag that one to the top. And so now they're kind of more in order. So we've got foreground, middle ground, background. Okay. So if I zoom in to here, say this moss, which is in the foreground, we can see that's not particularly sharp. If I turn off the two layers above, now we can see, because we focused on that foreground, that's noticeably sharper. Hopefully you can see that on YouTube. If I turn that background focus layer back on, you can see a subtle but noticeable loss of sharpness. Okay, and that's what we're going to mitigate with our focus stacking. So I'm going to put all of those back on, zoom back to our fit. Okay, so the first thing I'll do is turn off this top layer. We're just going to be working with the middle layer and the base layer for now. The base layer we're not going to touch essentially now, that can just stay where it is. But what we want to do is, so at the moment we're seeing only this middle layer because it's exactly the same size as the layer underneath. And the first thing we want to do is make it completely invisible by adding a layer mask. So I'm going to click this little mask icon down here. Looks like a theatrical mask. And initialize layer mask to black is what we want. And essentially what that does is makes that layer invisible. You can see that shift there where the clouds were. And if I affect the visibility, you see nothing's actually changing. This layer mask is making this layer completely transparent, if you like. And then what we want to do is draw on this mask to define where the image will be visible, or the layer will be visible rather. So I'm going to use the gradient tool, and I'm going to change the shape, or choose the shape bilinear. I think the default's normally linear. I'm going to use bilinear. So that's going to give me a fade out from white to black, both above and below the line on an axis I define. So, I mean, there's no, you could probably sit and kind of pixel peep to really pick the sharpest areas if you wanted to, but I'm going to assume that kind of up to this moss is more or less in focus. I think it is from what we looked at before, and probably up to about here. The focus is going to be close enough between these two layers that a nice soft blend should do the trick. So I'm going to click and just drag my gradient like that, and then hit enter. Now, nothing immediately appears to have happened, but if we show our layer mask by alt clicking, there we go, we see that we've drawn that gradient on. So essentially what we're doing is revealing this layer, and we're revealing the layer just where this white and grey band is. Okay, so alt click to see the actual layer mask itself. And now we've done that, we can essentially do the same thing with the farthest focus layer. Just going to turn it back on. So now you can see that that layer is now kind of overtaken all the others. And we're going to do the same thing before. We're going to add a black layer mask. And now we're seeing the two layers underneath, but only part of this middle layer. And then this time we can just use a linear gradient. So we just want to come down from the top. I'm going to click down like that. Press enter. And there we go. So we can shift click that as well. Sorry, alt click. There we go. So we're only seeing the top part of this layer, which is where we focused anyway. We're seeing the middle part of the middle ground. And we're seeing, just because these ones are blocking it from above, we're seeing the foreground of this one. And so that's our focus stack essentially complete. We're seeing complete sharpness, or as sharp as we can get it, from front to back, just by adding a simple layer mask, very similar to masking in Darktable, but just in GIMP, which allows us to align layers. So now we're all focus stacked up. We can do what we want with this image. We can just save it straight from here. If we want to bring it back into Darktable, we can do that. So let's pull it back into Darktable, say for adding a frame. So we can go to File, Export As, and then we'll call it stacked.tiff. Just the test, so we'll call it stacked1. We'll export, and that will come up with some options. You don't need to save layers, and you don't need any compression, or you could do LZW. That should be no problem for Darktable as well. And you may want to turn on save EXIF if you want to keep the EXIF information like focal length, etc. And then just click export. That will trundle away, and it's quite a big file actually when you're not compressing things. Okay, we're done. So that's a 176 megabyte file. So I'm just going to pull that back into Darktable. The easiest way to do that is to go back to Darktable and just drag in the file. There we go. And because this isn't a raw file, you see that we won't have all the available modules that we normally do. There's no exposure or anything like that. We could add it in if we wanted to, but I'm just going to use a frame and we'll turn that on and make it 5% white. So there we go. That's how we focus stack with Darktable, GIMP and QMic GT. Hope you find this one useful. It's a great way to really maximize sharpness in your images, overcome the laws of physics, overcome maybe not the greatest lenses in the world that you happen to have. And it's very effective. You know, it's very quick to do and really gives a boost to sharpness throughout your image. So I hope you found it useful. Do like and subscribe if you haven't already. Thanks very much for watching, and I will catch you on the next one.